Hello anatomists, Michele Glass here, and our job for this video is to study arteries of the body. Now the arteries are the vessels that carry the blood away from the heart out to the body, or we can say to the systemic circuit. And as such, you would expect this blood to be oxygenated or oxygen rich. And so we're going to see it represented by the color red. Now, all of the vessels we'll be talking about in this video will be arteries. And so that will be part of the name. And to simplify our instruction, I will not use the word artery every time. So I won't say radial artery, and I won't say carotid artery, and I won't say femoral artery, but that is part of the name. So make sure that you are remembering that and responding that way when it comes time for a quiz or an exam. Now there are going to be a couple of larger vessels that we'll be looking at here, and those larger vessels will go by the name trunk, just to indicate it's a really big artery. And so when we are talking about, for instance, brachiocephalic trunk, I will be sure and indicate that that is an important part of the name. And so let's get started by looking at vessels that we already know. So look for your heart right here. You can see that. And we can see our ascending aorta. We can see our aortic arch. And then we can see our descending aorta, which goes back behind the heart. Now here what we're going to see is we can actually talk about the portion of the descending aorta in the thoracic cavity as the thoracic aorta. And then we're going to talk about the portion of the aorta in the abdominopelvic cavity, or I guess really just in the abdominal cavity as the abdominal aortic. And do a quick edit there. It's not thoracic aortic, it's thoracic aorta and abdominal aorta. Looking back up at the arch, remember we have 3 vessels coming off, and we've actually already named those. And so let's begin with that first vessel that we see coming off of the arch. So that first vessel that we see is, remember, the brachiocephalic trunk. So brachio is referring to it's going to go into the arm, and cephala is referring to it's going to go up into the head. The next vessel that we can see is the left common carotid. And then we're seeing the left subclavian artery. And so this side of our model is the right side, and this side of our model is the left side. Now paying attention to the right side of the model, taking a look at that right brachiocephalic trunk. We don't have to actually call it a right brachiocephalic trunk, we just call it the right. What we'll see is coming off of the brachiocephalic trunk, that first artery that we see there will be the right common carotid. And then this next vessel we see is the right vertebral artery. And we have also a left vertebral artery that you can actually see right here. So I've circled the left. Let me get my pointer. So right here is the left vertebral artery. Okay, so tracing again, we have the blood coming from the okay, I lost my pointer froze, so I paused and hopefully it will work. So blood coming from the left side of the heart is going to go up the ascending aorta to the arch. And from the arch, we'll see some of that blood going through the brachiocephalic trunk. And from the arch, we'll see some of that going to the right, to the left common carotid, excuse me. And we'll also see from the arch some of that blood going into the left subclavian artery. Now, as we look at the brachiocephalic trunk, we see from there we branch off the right common carotid and then the right vertebral, and then that blood vessel continues down into the arm. And so let's name some of those, and then we'll look at a diagram that really lets us see those details a lot better. So from the brachiocephalic trunk, we're going to get to our right subclavian artery. And then as we get into this sort of armpit area, so right in about here, the right subclavian artery changes name and it becomes called the axillary. And we're still on the right side, so we have a right and we have a left. As the axillary gets down into this area by the humerus, we're going to refer to that here as the right brachial artery. And then as it comes down into the elbow, we'll see it divides. And on the radial side of the forearm, we have the right radial artery. And then on the pinky finger side or medial side, we would have the right ulnar artery. As we get into the palm of the hand, we'll see that we have a deep and a superficial. And so the deep vessel is called the deep palmar arch, and the superficial is called the superficial palmar arch. And then extending down into all of the fingers here, we have digital arteries. So far in this particular diagram, we've looked at some of those vessels we learned when we looked at the heart model, and then we saw how they branched up into the head and down into the arm. Again, we should be able to trace the flow of blood. So let's try that again with our laser. So you may want to take notes on this. So from the left ventricle, blood is pumped out the ascending aorta to the arch. And at the arch, it's going to pump out the brachiocephalic artery. And some of that blood goes up the right common carotid, and some of that blood goes up the right vertebral, and some of that blood continues into the right subclavian artery. The right subclavian artery, as it enters into the armpit area, becomes called the right axillary. And then as it continues down into the arm, which remember is from the shoulder to the elbow, it's called the right brachial artery. Below the elbow, we see that it divides to form the right radial. So remember that's going to be on the lateral side, that's going to be on the thumb side. And then we have also a branch called the right ulnar artery. And remember that would be on the medial side or the pinky finger side. Notice that those arteries then go into either a deep palmar arch or a superficial palmar arch, and that kind of extends, it looks a little closer to the fingers. And then branching off of those palmar arches, you have the digital arteries. Looking at the left side, from the arch, you have the blood going into the left common carotid. And from the arch, you then have the blood going directly into the left subclavian artery. Notice the left vertebral, that's the little piece I've circled, would come directly off the left subclavian. Notice the left subclavian, again, as it goes into the armpit region, changes name to left axillary. And then as it goes into the arm, it's again called left brachial. And then as it goes on the lateral side of the forearm, it's called the left radial. Medial side is the left ulnar. And then we have the deep palmar arches, superficial palmar arches, and the digital arteries. Okay, anatomists, we can actually do this again. We have the same vessels here. We just have a more close-up version, and we're looking specifically here at the right side. So the left arm has been dissected. So here's our aortic arch. So right here, we would have the brachiocephalic trunk. This should be review. We have the right common carotid artery here. And then this next vessel we see is the right vertebral. Then we see our, let me do it this way, our right subclavian, which becomes our right axillary, which becomes the right brachial, which divides to make the right radial. Excuse me. And the right ulnar. And then here you would see the deep palmar arches and the superficial palmar arches. And then, of course, digital arteries going to the fingers. We can see here our thoracic aorta. We can see here the left common carotid, and that's pretty much what we can label from this particular diagram. From here, let's take a look at our head. So this is the left side, and this is the right side. So that means right here, we're looking at the brachiocephalic trunk. That makes this the right common carotid. And then that lets us real easily see our right vertebral artery. And notice it's going up through those transverse foramen that you labeled in A and P1. Notice the right common carotid as it moves up to the head, it splits. And so we have what's called the external carotid, and then we have our internal carotid. Now coming off of the external, we're going to have three branches that we'll be labeling. So we can see right here the facial artery. We can see right here the maxillary. And then we can see, I'll label it right here, the superficial temporal. So let me get my pointer. So we have from the brachiocephalic, the right common carotid, which splits into the external carotid and the internal carotid. The external carotid splits into the facial, so it's going to structures of the face. Continuing up the external carotid, we need to label the branch that's called the maxillary. So it's going to the maxilla or upper jaw. And then we have a branch going straight up the temporal bone area here, so superficial temporal. If we go back to the internal carotid, we don't have to name any branches coming off of that. If we look back at the right vertebral, we are going to label an artery here, which is called the basilar basilar artery. Looking back down here at the shoulder area, this is our right subclavian artery. And then right in here, I would say, is where we're going to have the right axillary artery. We do want to take a look at how these arteries spread into and nourish the tissue of the brain. So what we're seeing right here and right here, these are actually our left and right vertebral arteries. So we're seeing both of these here. The vertebral arteries feed into the basilar. The basilar divides into what's referred to as the posterior cerebral. So you have this on the left, and then you see it on the right side as well. So you see it on both sides, basilar. Notice the basilar then goes into these vessels here. So these vessels here, we're going to name posterior communicating. And then right here, we have on both sides what's called the middle cerebral. Then we have what's called the anterior communicating. And then we have so anterior communicating would be all of this kind of top circle. And then we have what's called the anterior cerebral. So let's trace it with our pointer. So we have blood coming up the vertebral arteries forming the basilar artery. And then we see posterior cerebral feeding the back of the brain. Then we have posterior communicating on both sides, which comes around to connect with the anterior communicating, which then forms the anterior cerebral, which goes to the front. And we do see this large vessel here that's going to serve the middle of the brain, the middle cerebral. Notice right here, we are seeing the vessels come together to form a circle. Do you see? That circle consists of posterior communicating, anterior communicating. We have the posterior cerebral, anterior cerebral, and middle cerebral coming off of that circle. So when we talk about that circle, we're going to include these 4 vessels in that circle, and we're going to call it the cerebral arterial circle, super creative name, or you can call it circle of Willis. Now looking at this bottom view of the brain, this side view, we can see the vertebral coming in. Right here is the internal carotid. Right here then is going to be the basilar. Right here is going to be posterior cerebral. And then like right here, we're seeing our circle. And this big one right here is the middle cerebral artery. And this one here would be anterior cerebral artery. Okay. Taking a look next in our torso, we can again name several things that we've named already. So here's our arch. Here's our trying to come up with best places to label. Subclavian artery, that right there is actually vertebral. Here's common carotid. So you're actually seeing the brachiocephalic here, trunk, and we called this our thoracic aorta. You have blood vessels in between all of your ribs, and so we're going to call those the intercostal arteries. And then this tissue here is the diaphragm, and so this blood vessel we see coming over top is called the superior phrenic. And so the blood vessel coming off the bottom right here would be the inferior phrenic, where phrenic is referring to the diaphragm. This whole portion, this huge vessel running down the abdominal cavity is the abdominal aorta. And I'm not going to actually label it here because I think it will get in the way of our other labels. So what I do want to label next is we have this large group of 3 vessels coming off right below the diaphragm. And the connecting vessel there is called the celiac trunk. And on the left side, we have the left gastric artery. And then next we have the splenic artery going to the spleen. And then over on the right side here, we would have the hepatic artery going to the liver. And I'll show you this in context with some organs. As we go below the celiac trunk, this large vessel here is called superior mesenteric. And then this large vessel here is the inferior mesenteric. So superior mesenteric is going to basically be innervating tissue surrounding small intestine, whereas the inferior mesenteric is going to be basically innervating is the wrong word, but feeding the tissue of the large intestine. We're seeing this organ here is the kidney, and you know that sitting on top, this triangular shaped structure is the adrenal gland. So the vessel that goes to the adrenal gland is called the adrenal artery. The vessel that goes to the kidney is called the renal artery. And then we have a pair of vessels going to the gonads, and we call those the gonadal arteries. After the inferior mesenteric branches off, we have a pair we can see low down, and that's our lumbar. I said the word low down, and I wrote the word lower. Lumbar arteries. And then this abdominal aorta splits into what's called the common iliac. So we see branches going into the left and the right sides. Now we see that the common iliac then splits, and we have a branch that's going to be more internal to the body. So this branch is going to be called the internal iliac, Whereas this branch that's going to be more external is called the external iliac. As we look at this and next, we can see our liver, we can see our stomach. Apparently I can't spell stomach. We can see our pancreas. This is the spleen. This is the large intestine. This is representing small intestine. Okay, so we're seeing our abdominal aorta, and we're seeing our celiac trunk, and we see how we have the vessel that's branching off to the stomach, left gastric, and then we see our splenic artery branch, and then we see our hepatic branch. As we go below the celiac trunk right here, we can see superior, mesenteric, and here we would see the inferior mesenteric. And then this here would be common iliac. This would then be internal iliac and let me actually label it here, external iliac. Okay, we have one more set of diagrams to look at, and this is looking at the blood flow going down into the lower appendage. So here we have our common iliac, internal iliac. Just to be clear, you see your toe, so this is the anterior view, and this is the posterior view. And then let's call this right here the external iliac. As the external iliac goes down into the leg area, we're going to label this whole bit of vessel that's going behind the femur, beside and behind the femur, as the femoral artery. And then we can see kind of curving around what we can call the deep femoral. So on this posterior view, we see the femoral here, and we see the deep femoral here. As we trace that femoral, artery behind the knee, we call this the popliteal. And then we can see the popliteal divides. And so we have a vessel that's going to come around to the front, and that's the anterior tibial, and one that stays at the back. So that's the posterior tibial. And then coming off of the posterior tibial, we have the fibular. As that anterior tibial gets down to the foot, we call that vessel the dorsalis pedis. And then we have a dorsal arch, and we have a plantar. And then we would have, of course, digital arteries going to the toes. All right, you all. So this is our instruction for arteries. You will not have any practice videos, but you will have the file with the diagrams so you can practice labeling. So make sure you take care of that. Let me know if you have questions. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.